kitchen smelled of basil, gone to seed and yesterday's bread. It was a particular smell, one that spoke not of poverty exactly, of a household that had learned to stretch every small mercy until it wore thin. Margaret Elliston knew it the way a sailor knows the wind, not by thinking, but by living inside it, to day after day, until it became the texture of her life. She was 26 that autumn, though the weariness behind her eyes belonged to someone older. Her hands, fine-boned and steady, moved across the ledger on the kitchen table with the precision of a woman who had been balancing impossible sums since she was 17. The numbers never changed. They simply grew worse, column by column, month by month, a slow arithmetic of decline that no amount of cleverness could reverse. Briarstone Manor had been beautiful once. Her grandmother had told her stories of summers, when the gardens blazed with color and carriages lined the drive on Saturday evenings. That was before her grandfather's investments turned to ash, before her father inherited nothing but the house and its debts, before her mother died, trying to keep up appearances in a home that was quietly falling apart around them. Now the east wing was closed off entirely, its rooms surrendered to damp and silence. The roof above the old nursery leaked when the rain came from the north, which in Nova Scotia meant most of the time. The wallpaper in the front hall was peeling at the seams, and Margaret had learned to position the one good lamp so that visitors, not that there were visitors, would not notice. She closed the ledger and pressed her palms flat against the table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her skin. Through the window she could see the November garden, stripped bare, the skeletal branches of her mother's apple trees reaching into a sky the color of pewter. Beyond the orchard, the land rolled down toward the Minas Basin, where the tides came and went with the patience of something that would outlast them all. Her father found her there. Edward Elliston had the look of a man who had been handsome in his youth and had spent the decades since apologizing for it. His gray. His hair had gone white too early. His shoulders stooped as though the weight of the house rested physically upon them. He stood in the doorway, turning a letter over in his hands, the way a man turns a stone he is afraid to look beneath. Margaret. She knew that tone. It was the tone that preceded bad news dressed up as opportunity. There is a gentleman arriving tomorrow, a Mr. Hale from Halifax. He has expressed interest in the property. Margaret set down her pen. Interest in purchasing it? Her father would not meet her eyes. Interest in assessing its potential. He is an investor, I'm told, a man of considerable resources. The word investor sat between them like a third person in the room. Margaret understood what it meant. Another creditor's agent. Another pair of cold eyes measuring the worth of their walls, their land, their dwindling dignity. She had endured 3 such visits in the past year. Each one left her father more diminished, more desperate. What do you need for dinner? Something respectable. And your presence at the table. He attempted a smile that did not reach his eyes. You know I am no good at conversation when I am nervous, and I am always nervous now. I will see to it. He nodded, relieved, and retreated down the hallway. She listened to his footsteps, uneven on the warped floorboards, growing fainter. Then she opened the ledger again, not to the accounts but to the back pages where she kept her own private inventory, the pantry stores, the kitchen garden yields, the careful calculations of what could be served to a stranger without revealing the full extent of their want. There were turnips, potatoes, a salt cod Mrs. Beach had put up in September, and a jar of preserved pears from the orchard. It would have to do. She did not change her dress. She owned 3. And the brown wool she was wearing was the most practical. The blue merino was too tight across the shoulders since she had begun doing the heavy garden work herself, and the dark green, her mother's, altered twice, she saved for church. Brown wool it would be. She was not performing for anyone. The carriage arrived at 2:30 the following afternoon at tea. It was not the modest hired conveyance she had expected. A coach, black and well sprung, drawn by a pair of matched bays, whose breath steamed in the cold, salt air. The driver wore a heavy wool coat and moved with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to better roads than theirs. A single figure stepped out. He was tall, though not absurdly so, with dark hair cut close, and a face that was all angles and restraint. His eyes, when he looked up at Briarstone's weathered facade, were green, clay, not the bright green of spring leaves, but the darker shade of deep water, of the spruce forests that climbed the hills behind the property. He did not flinch at the peeling paint or the crooked shutter on the second floor. He simply looked, the way a man looks at a map, reading what is there, rather than what he wishes were there. The father was already at the door, his welcome too loud, too eager. Margaret descended the stairs slowly, her hand trailing the banister that she herself had tightened last month when the spindles came loose. She reached the hall as the men entered. The stranger removed his hat and gloves. His movements were economical, unhurried. Then he turned, and his gaze found hers. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. She felt, in that brief contact, the unsettling sensation of being accurately read, her plain dress, her work-roughened hands, the careful composure she wore like armor. He saw all of it, and of that. "My daughter, Margaret," Sir Edward said. "Margaret, this is Mr. Hale." Miss Elliston. His voice was low, with the clipped precision of a man who did not waste words. "Mr. Hale." She curtsied, a small, correct movement. "I hope your journey was not too difficult, Anne. The roads from Halifax are unkind this time of year. I have endured worse. There was no warmth in it, but no arrogance either. It was simply a fact. Dinner was an exercise in endurance. Mrs. Beach had transformed the salt cod into something almost elegant, and the preserved pears, served with a sliver of hard cheese, made a dignified end to the meal. Sir Edward talked about the harbour, the history of the county, the old shipbuilding days, filling every silence with anxious chatter while their guest ate methodically and said almost nothing. His green eyes moved across the room, cataloguing every crack in the plaster, every mended seam in the tablecloth. He spoke to Margaret once. "The orchard, Miss Elliston, those are Gravenstein trees?" She looked up, startled. That most men of business did not know one apple variety from another. "They are. My mother planted them when she first came to Briarstone. They are old now, but they still bear well." "Gravensteins do not thrive on neglect," he said. "Someone has been caring for them." "I do what I can." He regarded her for a moment. "That is evident." It was not a compliment. It was an observation, delivered with the same detached precision as everything else he said. But it was the first honest thing anyone had said to her in months, and she felt the unexpected sting of being recognized. After dinner, she left the men to the remains of the brandy, a bottle she had been guarding for exactly such an occasion, and went to the library. It was her room, her one true sanctuary. The shelves held her grandfather's collection, maritime histories and philosophical treatises and botanical guides, their leather spines cracked but intact. The fire had gone out hours ago, but she did not mind the cold. She stood by the window and watched the moonlight silver the basin, and she waited. Her father came to her just before midnight. He looked as though he had aged a decade in a single evening. He has made a proposal. Margaret turned from the window. For the land? No. Her father sank into the chair by the dead hearth. It is not for the land, for you. The silence that followed was absolute. Outside, she could hear the wind moving through the bare branches of the apple trees, a thin, persistent sound. His name is not Hale, her father continued, his voice barely above a whisper. At time, he is James Ashworth, the Earl of Dunmore. Margaret felt the floor tilt beneath her. An Earl. Not a merchant, not a creditor. An Earl from one of the oldest families in the Maritimes, a Tom, whose holdings stretched from Cape Breton to the New Brunswick border. A man whose name appeared in newspapers she could no longer afford to buy. He requires a wife, her father said. He has been looking, quietly, it's discreetly, for a woman of good family who will not bring complications. No ambitious relations, no social entanglements. He wants the arrangement settled quickly and without spectacle. He wants a transaction, Margaret said. Her voice was very calm. He will clear every debt. The house will be repaired. And I will receive an income. Her father's hands were shaking. Margaret, we have nothing. We will have nothing. By spring we will lose Briarstone, and I will. His voice broke. There is no other way. At him. She looked at him, this man who had once carried her on his shoulders through the orchard, who had read to her from those same library books, wept silently at her mother's grave every Sunday for 6 years. He was asking her to save him. He had always been asking her to save him. Tell his lordship I will see him before breakfast. I have conditions. She found him in the library at dawn. He was standing precisely where she had stood the night before, looking out at the grey morning water. In the pale light he looked less severe. There were shadows beneath his eyes, and the hard line of his jaw was softened by a weariness that, she realized, was not so different from her own. He turned when she entered. He did not seem surprised to see her. Elliston. My lord. She clasped her hands in front of her. My father has conveyed your proposal. I accept on 2 conditions. He waited. Something shifted behind those green eyes. Not displeasure, but a recalibration, a reassessment of the woman standing before him. First, my father's debts will be settled. His income will be administered by your solicitor. He is not to manage money. History has shown he cannot. Agreed. Second. She took a breath. This was for herself. I will fulfill every obligation of a wife and a countess. I will manage your households. I will provide an heir, God willing, but I will not be ornamental. I have spent my life keeping a failing estate alive with my own hands. I know the cost of every candle, every seed, every plank of wood. I will bring that knowledge to your home, and I expect to be permitted to use it. The silence stretched between them. He studied her the way he had studied the house, thoroughly without sentiment. You believe the management of a household to be meaningful work. I believe that anything done with care and intelligence has meaning. A house without someone who cares for it is just architecture. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the shadow of one, the possibility. Very well, Miss Elliston. We have an agreement. He extended his hand. She took it. His grip was firm, his skin cool. A name, he said, is James. I will use it when I am ready. They were married 4 days later in the small stone church that overlooked the basin. The ceremony was brief, attended only by her father, Mrs. Beach, and the rector's wife. Margaret wore her green dress, her mother's dress, and carried a sprig of rosemary from the kitchen garden. There were no flowers in November, but rosemary, she knew, was for remembrance. The journey to Ashworth Park took 2 days by coach. It travelled in near silence, the landscape changing from the red earth and bare orchards of the Annapolis Valley to the deep forests and granite outcrops of the interior. James read. Margaret watched the world pass by and tried to make peace with the enormity of what she had done. Ashworth Park revealed itself at the end of a long drive, flanked by ancient maples. It was vast, a sprawling stone manor with wings reaching east and west, its windows glinting in the late afternoon light like dozens of watchful eyes. The grounds were immaculate, the gardens formal and geometric, every hedge trimmed to military precision. It was beautiful and utterly without warmth. The staff, 23 of them, lined up in the entrance hall with expressions of professional neutrality, assessed her in a single glance. She saw it in their eyes. The plain dress, the absence of a lady's maid, the single modest trunk. She was not what they had expected. She was not what anyone expected. The housekeeper, Calloway, a formidable woman with steel-grey hair and a spine to match, led her to a suite in the west wing. The rooms were exquisite, French wallpaper, mahogany furniture, carpets thick enough to muffle every footstep. A fire burned in the hearth, throwing shadows against the silk-covered walls. It was the most beautiful room Margaret had ever stood in, and it felt like a beautifully furnished prison. She dined alone that first night, and the second, and the third. James. Lord Dunmore, her husband, the stranger she had married, ate in his study, she was told. He had always eaten in his study. She became a ghost in her own home. She walked the corridors, her footsteps absorbed by the thick carpets. She saw servants who pressed themselves against walls as she passed. She was the Countess of Dunmore, a title that felt like someone else's coat draped awkwardly across her shoulders. She had been promised meaningful work, and instead she had been given magnificent, suffocating emptiness. The library saved her. It was enormous, 2 stories high, with a gallery running the upper level and windows that looked out over a frozen, ornamental lake. The collection was extraordinary: histories, sciences, philosophy, and an entire section on agriculture and land management that bore the bookplates of 3 generations of Ashworths. She began to read with a hunger she had not felt since her mother died. If no one would teach her the language of this new world, she would teach herself. It was there, 10 days after her arrival, that he found her. She was sitting in the window seat with a treatise on maritime soil composition when she looked up and saw him in the doorway watching her. "I was not aware that collection saw any use," he said. "Your grandfather annotated the margins. He had a keen mind for drainage patterns." He entered the room. His gaze swept the shelves. He believed the land mattered more than the title. He was right. James stopped a few paces from her, his eyes on the book in her lap. "Me. You are not what I anticipated." "What did you anticipate?" "Complaints, demands for new things, perhaps tears. I have no use for any of those." A thread of steel entered her voice. "We made a bargain. I asked for work. Since none has been offered, I have been preparing for it." He was quiet for a long moment. She had challenged him, and she did not look away. "Mrs. Calloway runs this house, precisely as it has been run for 40 years, he said. "I have no doubt she is excellent at it. But this is meant to be a home, not an institution. A home requires someone who cares about it, not merely someone who maintains it. Ashworth Park runs like a clock. It does not live, gone too far. She knew it immediately. She had criticized his home, his legacy. She braced for coldness. Instead, he looked around the library, the perfect shelves, the gleaming surfaces, the vast and immaculate silence. And something crossed his face that she had not seen before, a recognition. Loneliness he had been carrying so long he had mistaken it for discipline. "No," he said quietly. "It has not lived for a long time." He left without another word. But the next morning, Mrs. Calloway appeared at Margaret's door with the household account books and a message from his lordship. The Countess was to review them at her convenience. The change was not dramatic, and it was a series of small, deliberate acts. Margaret replaced the massive dining table, a dark oak monument that seated 24, with a round walnut table she found in a morning room. She placed a jar of dried lavender at its center, the stems she had saved from a neglected patch behind the kitchen garden. The first evening, James entered the dining room and stopped, staring at the small, intimate arrangement. "Fionn, I hope you don't mind," she said. He pulled out her chair. It was the first courteous gesture he had made since their wedding. "It is an improvement." Dinner was different that night. The table forced proximity, and proximity forced conversation. He asked about the book she had been reading. She answered hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. Soil acidity, crop rotation for maritime climates, the potential for the neglected east pasture. He listened, not politely, sir, not patiently, but with genuine attention, the way a man listens when he is hearing something he did not know he needed. She was not lecturing, she was sharing, and for the first time he saw her, not Miss Elliston, not the Countess, but Margaret, a woman with a sharp, curious mind and a quiet, immovable strength. He felt something stir that he had not felt in years. Interest, the arrival of his aunt, Lady Phoebe Ashworth, was like the arrival of a benevolent storm. She was 68, sharp-tongued, warm-hearted, and entirely unimpressed by convention. She swept into Ashworth Park, took one look at the round table, another at Margaret's plain but immaculate dress, and a third at the infinitesimally softer expression on her nephew's face, and understood everything. She cornered Margaret in the conservatory. "So, you're the girl James found in the hinterlands? Tell me honestly, child, are you frightened of him?" "No, Phoebe. Good. He is all frost and no fury. You'll thaw him out if you have patience." She peered at Margaret. "He says you demanded to manage the household. Have you begun?" "I have been reviewing the accounts." "Accounts?" Lady Phoebe waved a dismissive hand. "A house is not run from ledgers. It's run from the kitchen and the root cellar. Come with me." And just like that, Margaret was taken under a wing she had not known she needed. Lady Phoebe introduced her to the staff, not as the Countess to be feared, but as the new mistress to be known. She taught her the politics of a great household, which alliances mattered, which traditions to honor, which ones to quietly discard. She was the warmth Margaret had said was missing, returned and burning bright. The move to Halifax for the winter social season changed everything. Ashworth House on Barrington Street was grander even than the country estate, and Halifax society, smaller and more insular than London, but no less vicious for it, had been feasting on the news of the Earl's secret marriage for weeks. Margaret endured the scrutiny with the same composure she had worn since childhood. Lady Phoebe guided her through the treacherous social waters, and she found her footing, not by mimicking the fashionable women around her, but by being exactly who she was, intelligent, direct, and without pretense. She gathered a small circle of allies, bookish women, practical wives, people who valued substance over spectacle. But there was an enemy waiting. Isabel Fairfax was the acknowledged beauty of Halifax, golden-haired, wealthy, and possessed of a smile that could charm the paint from walls. She had spent 2 seasons cultivating the expectation that she would become the Countess of Dunmore. James's sudden marriage had been a public humiliation. The campaign began subtly. Missed invitations, cool nods, comments made just within earshot. Then it escalated. A rumor spread through the drawing rooms. The Elliston family had not merely been in debt. Sir Edward had been involved in a disgraceful speculation, and the Earl had married his daughter, not from choice, but to prevent a scandal. Margaret bore it in silence. She did not complain to James. She did not engage. But James saw. He saw the turned backs, the whispered conversations that died when Margaret entered a room at tea. He saw the way she held her shoulders a fraction higher each day, the effort it cost her to maintain her dignity, and he felt something ignite inside him, a fierce, protective fury he had never experienced before. She was his wife. An insult to her was an insult to him, and these feelings, he realized with a shock, were not logical. They were not contractual. They were the feelings of a man who was falling in love. The crisis came at a concert evening at Government House of Nubinesen. As Margaret moved to take her seat, the woman beside her, a friend of Isabel's, stood abruptly and declared, loud enough for the entire room to hear, that she found the atmosphere suddenly disagreeable. She moved away, leaving Margaret alone, a circle of empty chairs around her like a quarantine. James was across the room. He watched the calculated cruelty. He watched Margaret's face, the instant of pain swiftly mastered, the composure reassembled like a wall rebuilt from rubble. And something inside him, some last barricade of restraint, shattered. He crossed the room in 4 strides. He stopped before her, offered his hand and said, his voice carrying clear and calm across the sudden silence, "Margaret, I find this program tiresome. Walk with me." He did not wait for an answer. He took her hand, placed it in the crook of his arm, and led her out of the room. It was public. It was unequivocal. He had chosen pity in the cold garden, under the bare trees and the winter stars. Margaret's composure finally cracked. A single tear ran down her cheek, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand, an impatient gesture as though the tear were an inconvenience she could not afford. "They will not break you," James said. His voice was rough, urgent. He turned her gently to face him, his hands on her arms. "Do you hear me? I will not allow it. Why does she despise me? I have done nothing to her." "You exist," he said. "You took what she believed was hers. Her hatred has nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with her vanity." He looked at her, this woman who had faced ruin, his own coldness, and the cruelty of an entire city with nothing but her own quiet courage. And the love he felt for her was so sudden and so overwhelming that it robbed him of breath. "The midwinter ball," he said. "We are hosting it in 3 weeks. It is the most important event of the season. You will not hide. You will stand beside me, and we will face them together." She looked up at him, and something passed between them. Not a contract, not an obligation, but the first true recognition of what they were becoming. "Together," she said. The night of the Ashworth Midwinter Ball, every notable family in Nova Scotia was in attendance. The ballroom blazed with candlelight, the air thick with the scent of pine boughs and beeswax. An orchestra played from the gallery. It was magnificent, and beneath the magnificence, the tension was a living thing. Isabel Fairfax arrived early, resplendent in sapphire silk, diamonds at her throat. She positioned herself at the center of the room, holding court, her laughter pitched to carry. She was ready for the final act. Margaret and James entered together. Yes, a hush fell. She was not wearing the family jewels. She was not trying to compete. Sir, she wore a gown of ivory wool, Canadian wool, fine and simple, cut with an elegance that owed nothing to London fashion. Her only ornament was a string of freshwater pearls, a gift from Lady Phoebe, and a sprig of dried rosemary pinned above her heart. She was luminous in her simplicity. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who knew her own worth. They circulated. James's hand never left the small of her back. His presence was not aggressive. It was simply absolute. The moment came, as it always would. Isabel detached herself from her circle and approached, her smile crystalline with malice. "Your ladyship," she said, "you look rather pale. I do hope the pressures of Halifax society are not overwhelming. It must be so difficult when one's family name carries such complicated associations." The silence around them was absolute. Margaret met her gaze with an expression that was not anger. It was pity. "On the contrary, Miss Fairfax, I find that honesty and good conscience are wonderful for one's health. You might try them." Before Isabel could respond, James stepped forward. He did not look at her, did not acknowledge her existence. His eyes were only on Margaret. "Margaret," he said, his voice low and warm, "I believe this is our waltz." He took her hand and raised it to his lips. Then he turned to the room and spoke, his voice carrying her to every corner. "My friends," he said, "many of you have met my wife these past weeks. I fear you may have been listening to the wrong people, so allow me to tell you what I know." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before returning to Margaret's face. "I married this woman for practical reasons. I will not pretend otherwise, but I stand before you tonight as a man transformed by her courage, her intelligence, and her grace. She brought warmth into a house that had forgotten what it meant. She brought honesty into a life that had been running on obligation alone. I did not deserve her when I proposed. I am not certain I deserve her now. But I love her, without reservation, today, without condition, and I will spend the rest of my life attempting to be worthy of it." He held out his hand. "Margaret, will you dance with me?" Tears stood in her eyes. She placed her hand in his. "Yes, James." The orchestra struck the first notes of the waltz. The floor cleared. They moved together, two people who had come to each other through necessity, and found, against all expectation, something that neither had dared to hope for. He looked only at her. "I was a fool," he murmured. "I offered you a contract when I should have offered you my heart." "You offered me exactly what I needed," she whispered. "A chance to be seen." Across the room, Isabel Fairfax stood, frozen, the color draining from her face. She had been made invisible. In whispers, her machinations, her careful cruelties, all of it rendered meaningless by a single act of honest love. She turned and left the ballroom without a word. No one watched her go. Spring came to Ashworth Park with the smell of wet earth and the first tentative green. The gardens, under Margaret's careful planning, were changing. The rigid geometric hedges remained, but between them she had planted wildflowers, lupins and daisies and black-eyed Susans, so that the formal lines were softened by unruly bursts of color. It was, she thought, a fair description of what had happened to their life. She was sitting on the stone bench by the lake, a book open in her lap, when James came to find her. He had been in the east pasture all morning, overseeing the new drainage system she had designed from his grandfather's notes, and his boots were muddy. His hair was disordered by the wind. He looked nothing like an earl and everything like a man who had found, at last, a life worth living. He sat beside her and took her hand. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "The drainage is working," he said. "The lower field is already drier. Your design was sound. Your grandfather's design. I only adapted it. You saw what he intended and made it real. That is no small thing." They sat in the quiet, listening to the blackbirds and the distant sound of water. His thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. "Margaret, you are happy here?" She turned to look at him, this man who had been a stranger and was now the center of her world. His green eyes, so guarded when she had first met them, were open now, warm, uncertain, entirely hers. "I am happy," she said. "I am home." He kissed her forehead, then rested his cheek against her hair. "I have something I want to show you. Lady Phoebe helped me find it. Me." He led her through the house to a room in the east wing she had not yet seen. A bright, south-facing chamber with windows overlooking the orchard. The walls had been freshly papered in a soft yellow, and the room was furnished simply. A rocking chair by the window, a small bookshelf, a cradle made of pale birchwood, hand-carved and exquisite. Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth. "I know it is early," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know we have not spoken of it directly, but I wanted you to know that when the time comes, and I very much hope it will, this house will be ready. Our child will have a home with a heart." She turned to him, tears on her cheeks, and for the first time since she had married him, she crossed the distance between them, not out of duty or obligation, but out of love, pure and uncomplicated. She put her arms around him and held him, and he held her back, and the room with its yellow walls and birchwood cradle stood witness to the quiet, extraordinary thing they had built from nothing but honesty and care. She thought of the girl in the brown wool dress, balancing impossible ledgers in a cold kitchen. She thought of the woman who had carried rosemary instead of flowers at her own wedding. She thought of the sprig of rosemary still pressed between the pages of her favorite book, and she understood now what she had been remembering. Not the past, not the loss, but the stubborn, persistent belief that something worth tending would in time grow. Thank you for listening to this story all the way to the end. Please tell us where you are watching from and what part of the story touched you most.